it says in verse 1, now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into a land that I will show thee. So let's just stop here. That's the first time. Now literally, first time that God ever told somebody you need to leave your family, and there's this element of faith involved in it. Now, of course, we don't include Adam and Eve being kind of pushed out of the garden, but we're talking about this idea that God is about to establish something with a person, and it happens to be Abram here. And of course, notice verse 2, first time you hear about this great covenant that God is going to make with Abram. He says, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. So let's just look here a little bit. First off, the first nation, this is the first nation that God created. Now I know we've already seen some names mentioned. You could go back to chapters 10 and 11. You see all these names, and so begat so-and-so, and you start to see this dividing of the families and that sort of thing. And of course, going back to what we talked about with Noah, think about this. There's Noah and his wife, and then his 3 sons and the daughters-in-law, and they begin to have families. And we can say a lot about that, but the point is these things, as time goes on and generations, you start to see a lot of things are starting to happen. So the point is, though, it's the first time that God says, I'm going to create a nation. Now, I think that's important because if you remember Sunday night a week ago, about as these families start to reproduce and have their direction, and the way they named themselves after themselves, and the way they pride themselves on some of the skills they had, and yet this is the first time where officially God says, I'm going to make a nation. Now, I think that's significant because when I think about America, I really believe that God used people to start a nation that God wanted to start, and I believe that. And there's a lot of evidence to that, and I know we take great pride in that. At least I think some people do, and some are trying to distance themselves from that, this Judeo-Christian foundation that we have. But there's something about how the world tries to do it a certain way and how God says, now let me do it. In other words, it's like even the church itself. God said, I will start the church and I will build the church. And if it's along that mindset, then there's the blessings and the success of it. So the point I'm making is it's very important to understand that God says, I'm going to make of thee, Abram, a great nation. So I realize as time goes on, nations start to really become prevalent, just like when you think about Egypt. Egypt was becoming and was really like a nation, and there was a mindset in that nation. And just like we live today, we have our nation and other nations. But God says, I'm going to make of thee a great nation. I think it's significant that God is creating a nation, all right? Number 2 on my little outline there, God would exalt it and its people with greatness. And I think that's significant. He says, we're going to start a nation, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make you great. Now, again, I'm going to liken it to America. America is a nation that you compare it to all the other nations and look at the success and its dominance on the world scene in our lifetime and even before. So the point is, I think when God says, I'm going to establish you as a nation, Abram, and I'm going to make it great. He says, I'm going to make your name great too. He says, you're going to do that because I'm going to exalt you, and I'm going to make your name great. And then he says, and thou shalt be a blessing. This great nation would benefit all other nations. Notice verse 3 here. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And notice this, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Isn't it amazing that God says, when I make you the nation, that it's not going to be, okay, here's God's nation, if you please, and the rest of the world, too bad, so sad. No, God says, here's the way it's supposed to work. I'm going to make you a nation, and everybody's going to benefit because when I bless you, because I'm blessing you as a nation, the whole world will be blessed. Now, think again about America. America has benefited the world in many ways, and I think it's because of God's hand and his involvement in this nation building, if you please. I believe God has built nations, and certainly God has disassembled nations. You know that. But here's the first time God says, I'm going to take you as a man, as an individual, Abram, and I'm going to take you, and I'm going to make of you a great nation, and the earth is going to benefit from you and your nation. All right? So We'll expand on that here in just a minute here. All right, then notice verses 6 and 7. Well, let's go ahead and read down to there. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him in verse 4, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. So they were to leave a place they'd never been, and God's going to take them to this particular place, all right? It says, and Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sychem, unto the plain of Moreh. And notice this, and the Canaanite was then in the land. So this was already a place inhabited. So this is not a situation where God says, I'm going to take you to a blank piece of property, so to speak. God says no. And I think this is significant. And the Canaanite was then in the land. Notice verse 7. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. Now here's where I want to make a point here, because as we go along through our life and you look at our country, you look at Christianity, there's just this, you can see this evolving mindset, and the world's always had its positions, but there's this strong, and I'll use the word Christian, organized Christian entities. And again, I'm not talking about Catholicism. I'm talking about people that will say Bible-believing people. But there's this mindset that almost is an attack against God. And let me tell you for what reason. Here's my point I want to make. God says, I'm going to bring you to this land, and there's going to be people there already. And these are Canaanites, so they get that obviously from their name, the land of Canaan. But if we just go back even to Noah and those three sons, and I don't get too heavily involved in that, but the point is, there came this group of people, and they settled in the land of Canaan, and they called them Canaanites. But it's not just the fact that they're Canaanites because they live in a particular place. That had to have gotten a name from somewhere, and it obviously came from the name Canaan, all right? And you go back to Noah and all that, we could really expound on that, but I don't want to do that now. The point I want to make is God says you're going to leave this part of where you live, and you're going to leave all you can, and I'm going to take you to a place, and it's going to be, we know the land of Canaan, we get that, but there's people there, and these are the Canaanites. Now God says, I'm going to give you this land. Now here's the point. If he's going to give them that land, guess who's going to have to be booted out of it? However it's done, however it's supposed to be done. The point is God says you're going to go in this land, and these people are, in essence, are going to say, hey, we live here. Okay? You can understand that, right? And here's the argument. People say, well, it's just not fair that certain groups of people live in a certain place and somebody would come in and just remove them. That would be in a world where if you just said it that way, you would say, let's say somebody came to your house and says, I'm coming in your house, you're going to get out of this house, and I'm going to move in your house, and that's just the way it's going to be. We would all say, you can't do that. It's against the law. It's unethical. You just can't do that. And I would agree with that. However, in this case, God says, look, Abram, I'm going to make of you a great nation, and I'm going to take you to a place. I'm not going to make you a great nation where you're at. Now think about this. It's almost like a picture of salvation, because salvation is God gives you a brand new spirit, okay? He doesn't take the old flesh and says, we're going to make it better. So he didn't say to Abram, while you're living in where you're at and all your kin, we're going to make you there a great nation, and you just stay put where you're at, and this is going to work great for you. No, God says you're going to leave here, and you're going to leave all your kin, and you're going to go to a place where there's already people living, and they're Canaanites. Here they are. So the point I'm making is this. If you look at my little points underneath that, again, I know it's simple, and yet we better be careful if we don't think like this and with everything that we have and everything you see in the world. God is the creator, possessor, and owner of all land upon this earth. It all belongs to God. So for anybody to say, including myself, where I live at 6447 Allendale Drive, Archdale, hey, that's my property. Wait a minute. You know what it really belongs to? It belongs to God Almighty. God's allowed me to go there, and I realize I'm making a mortgage. We could laugh and say, aha, the credit union really owns it. Yeah, but I mean really in the real deep sense of things, that when people say this, God's allowed you to go to the place where you grew up, and that's wonderful. God's kind of given it to you. You know what? I believe that. You know why I believe that? Because God said to Abram, guess what, Abram? You're going to leave here and you're going to go over here. Someone else does live there. But guess what? I own it. It's my property. And I'm going to allow you to go there and it's going to be yours. Now, some people say, that's just not right. It wouldn't be right unless God does it. Now, listen to this, and I hope this don't offend anybody here, and I'm not trying to make a real big deal about this, but I'm speaking in very general terms, and yet I want to be very clear about this and make sure I'm not going outside the bounds of the Bible, okay? We live in America, right? We came from someplace. When I say we, our forefathers left basically Europe, that area, and came to what's called America. We could argue why it's called America and all that, and Columbus thought he had come to India, so he called the people Indians. So here's the point I'm making. All right, the argument is, even to this day, okay, we came from here, and we came here, and we said this is going to be our land. And some people said that wasn't right, unless God says it was right. You understand what I'm saying? Now you say, well, I don't know if I'd agree with that. No, wait a minute. If God said, here's some people that God's going to remove them from this place because it's become so bad for them, and God's going to bring them to a place. The idea, now I know there was things done, like mankind can do some things that can mess up even the best situations. I realize anybody that will come to this country and kill people, that's wrong. That's murder, right? Steal from people, I get that. But you think about a nation, if God says, I'm going to remove you from here and I'm going to bring you here and we're going to establish a nation. And some would say, well, I don't think it was right. That should have never been done. That's up to God. Now, I want you to understand that because the same argument is right here. People lived in Canaan and God said, now, look, God said, I'm going to have you go there and you're going to take this land because God says that's what's going to be right and we're going to do that. Now, the point I'm making here is in the general sense, the things that we have belong to God anyway. Hey, our bodies. You know, this idea that a woman can abort a baby because it's her body. Wait a minute. Does that body really, who does it really belong to? It belongs to God. God gave you life. God gives you the opportunity to nourish life and all that process. So for someone to ultimately say, I have a right to tell another human being you can live or not because it's my body, that goes against what the Bible says. It really does. You can't choose that because that's God's domain. But I'll say this, if God says there's any nation on this earth, and God says, I'm going to put my people there, and by the way, there's a responsibility for us, if God has allowed America to be born and to rise up, there is a responsibility to keep our minds and our intentions on what God intended. Now, if you look at America, and it's not perfect, I know that. And good night, we could sit here and discuss things just like we could look at your family, my family, and look at people in it and say, well, what about this situation? I get it. But let's talk about just in the general sense here, though. The general sense is if God says, yeah, but I've got some people I'm going to bring to America, and I'm going to make them great, I'm going to raise them up, and they're going to benefit the entire world because God says, I'm going to do this. Now, in that process, can you get out of sorts? Of course you can. I believe that. God put people on the throne. Look, Saul was a man before he was king. He never wanted to be king. He was the best person there was. But he became king. And through his own decisions, he drifted from God, and God removed his presence from him. But the point is, God says, I put you there. He didn't go through the land and say, okay, let's see, who's yearning to be king around here? Well, God picked him. You understand? So for people to say, well, Saul, he was a rotten apple to start with. No, he wasn't. Go back and look at the language of the Bible. He was the best one out of everybody in the land. In fact, on his day of coronation, he was hiding. He didn't even want to be king. But guess what? He became king because God appointed him to be king. Now, Saul went bad. Saul made some bad decisions, and God brought judgment on Saul because of that. So he can't look at God and say, God, this is your fault. You made me king, and I made bad decisions because you made me king. So I don't believe that. But I know this. Saul had a responsibility to be king since God put him there. Now, I know that God says it's not right for the nation to yearn for a king, but I'm going to give you one. And the very next one after that was David. And David had some issues, but the point is God sets these things up. And when God does that, you do have a responsibility. So in the case of Abram, he was going to come into this land. Now bear in mind, Abraham was on the very beginning stages of this. I get that. You know, Abram had to have Isaac, and Isaac had to have Esau and Jacob. And of course, Jacob had the 12 sons through 4 different women, which is crazy to me. When I go back and read that every time, it wasn't one single wife. The whole thing is bizarre, and yet to this day, the land of Israel is named after Jacob. I mean, that's the namesake. I'm going to change your name from Jacob to Israel, which means a prince, and you've had power with men and with God, and to be honest with you, Jacob had a pretty bad reputation. But the point is, Abram didn't see a lot of things, and neither did the 12 sons, because as I've been reading about Joseph in Egypt, and they go down into Egypt, and then they're there 430 years. There's no nation there. In fact, they're helping build another nation. Now, bear in mind, that wasn't God's judgment on them. God says, you know what, it's proper for Jacob and the rest of the family to go down to Egypt, because you would have starved to death had it not been for Joseph intervening. And again, God orchestrating all of this. But the point is, they did not initially go down into Egypt because they were disobeying God. No, they didn't. But God had already told even Abram in his day, he said, look, this people here is going to have some issues, and they're going to be in a land 400 some years, but that won't always be. They will eventually get to the land that you're supposed to be in, Canaan land. Now, so as I look at these things here, God is the creator, possessor, and owner of all land upon this earth and everything. And you say, well, that's so broad, should we really think that way? I think we should. I think when you go out to your car now, you say, God, thank you for the car you've allowed me to drive, and I hope that I can use this car for the glory of God. Lord, the clothes on my back, thank you, I'm warm tonight. And if we just constantly remind God of all the things that he's given us, that's a pretty good position to be in. God can give his land to whom he chooses. Now, here's the thing. You know who writes the rules? God does. And God is always right. Now, here's just in theory, in a world that we live in, whether or not this was the case or not, but I'll say this. I know God has a principle. God says, he gave a parable one day and says, look, I'm going to give this man some talents, and this man some talents, and this man a talent. And in the case of the first 2, they double theirs, and the Lord in the illustration says, you've done great, that's wonderful. You took what I gave you and you doubled it. You've been faithful, you've been good, well done. The one over here, on the other hand, what he did, he did nothing with it. In fact, he hid it, and he acted like almost like he was downplaying the master by saying, yeah, you know, you can turn anything, you can turn nothing in anything. He says, but I was afraid, I didn't know what to do, so I hid it. Here it is back. When in that illustration, the Lord didn't say, well, that's okay, buddy. Bless your heart. No, he says, you're wicked. And what did he do with the talent that this one had? He gave it, he took it from him and gave it to somebody else. Now, here's a principle. Here's where we ought to be careful. God could easily say, look, I gave some people an opportunity to live in a land. Now, you live in that land and you commit idolatry. You don't give honor and glory to God Almighty. I'm talking about the God of the Bible. And you don't honor him and respect him. And you say, this is my land and I'll do with it what I want to. Do you know that God has the right to say, oh, no, you don't? Oh, no, you don't. That's my land, and you're using that land. If you don't use it properly, then I'll have another people coming here, and let's see what they'll do with it. Now, you look in the Bible and tell me that's not something God's done before. He has. Now, here's the thing. Because we live in a world in which the mankind preaches what they say is right, and they do it absent of the Bible. You know that God's a righteous God, a holy God. He's also a very fair and loving God. But I know this. God says, look, you belong to me, and I've given you opportunities, and if you squander those opportunities or you don't give honor to God, God says, guess what? There's repercussions for that. And that's the way it is in this world. Mankind don't believe that. Look, there's this attitude that you don't have to work for anything. That's not a Bible philosophy. There's all kind of philosophies. I don't want to get in all of those because I'll just get up here and just get mad because I see a bunch of garbage and people, up is down and right is wrong and wrong is right and all that kind of stuff. But I know this, God is the standard, so he can give his land to whom he chooses. In this case, it says the Canaanites, it's not going to be your land. You know why? Because I believe those people were not living right. If you go back and look at the history there, you're going to see there's people that didn't live right, didn't do right. All right, God can certainly remove and replace any inhabitants of land that is his already. We understand that. And that includes us. And that's enough of that. Notice Abram's response and reaction to God's promise. He built an altar to God. So when God says, here's what we're going to do, we turn back there, then what does Abram do? Matter of fact, if you were to look here, look, this is just 12 chapters of the Bible. If you look at who built an altar, we know that Noah did. But I do in my mind want to ask myself, where did God in the Scripture say, build me an altar? Now, you kind of do that as a little bit of homework, even just for your own sake. Go back to Genesis 1 and you look and see, did God tell Adam and Eve, build me an altar? Did he tell Abel or Cain to do it? Now, I know he was supposed to get a sacrifice from the folks. We know that. We get that. But this idea that God comes to Abram and says, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'll make your name great, and people be blessed through you. And here's this land, and it's going to be yours. I'm going to give it to you. And the Bible says, and Abram built an altar. Now, is that something where God said, no, you build me an altar after I just got through telling you that? Or was it just the reaction that should be from all of us, that when God says, here's what I'm going to do for you, that he gave a sacrifice. He gave a way to say, thank you, dear God. Now, think about this altar. He built an altar. He sacrificed on it. Do you know that the animal that Abram sacrificed, that's not Abram saying, no, this is my, let's say it was a sheep, this is my sheep, and God, I'm going to give you something that's mine. The truth is that sheep belongs to God. And he was saying, look, I'm going to give you something that really is yours already, but I'm going to let you know, I'm willing to give you something back, God, that's yours already, instead of having the attitude, well, it's mine, I'm not giving it to anybody. That's such a worldly philosophy. So what about tithing then? Did you know that tithing was in the Bible before it was commanded, before what we call the official law? So this idea, well, that's part of the law. We don't have to do the law anymore. Well, it's funny that there was tithing going on. Now, where did God say, now, you give me 10%? No, we just find out it's done. Now, I'm not saying God didn't sit down and say, let me tell you something. Here's how this world works. All this is mine anyway. But I'm here to tell you this, there's something about people, even to this day, that when you get right with God, you're a Christian, that you know there's something about your life shouldn't be, that when you get right with God, it's not like, gimme, gimme, gimme. There's something about people. You notice people that get saved, they want to do something. You ever notice that? They want to do something. They want to help. You know what? I think that's innate, that God puts it in you to say, look, in the case of Abram here, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give you this land. I want to give you something back that's yours anyway. But I want you to know, God, I'll give you anything back. By the way, how about the son that God gave him, and Isaac? You talk about a man that had great faith. With all this process, and finally comes along, and then all of a sudden God says, give me your son, give me that son back. Now, let's think about Hannah. Hannah couldn't have any children. She was begging God, give me a child, give me a child, give me a child. And she says, I'll give it back to you, God, if you'll give it to me. Now, what an attitude. That's the way it's supposed to be. You know what? And here's the thing. You got parents. I've met them. I've done this long enough. I've seen enough people that they think somehow that their children are theirs and not God's at all. You know how we're supposed to raise children? To say, God, I want to train him in such a way so that I'm basically, in essence, really just giving them right back to you anyway. This idea, they're mine, and I'm going to raise those children how I want to raise them, and they won't even let them darken a church door. And think somehow they know better than God. I mean, it's sad to me that the families, and even connected with this church, that they say, you know what, I know what I'm doing, and God, no, God knows what he's doing. And those kids are a lot better to see parents that believe in the idea that, God, you gave me these kids, and I'll give them to you in full force if I had to. Just take them, God, if you need to. But God says, it all belongs to me. And I can make everything work out the way it's supposed to work for everybody. Everybody. What does God expect us to do with his land? I'm talking about us. I'll tell you what he expects us to do with it, use it rightfully. Hey, let me just say this. You hear about this global warming situation. And I'm not going to sit here like an independent fundamental Baptist preacher just to go off, that's a bunch of garbage. Well, wait a minute. We're all supposed to be custodians and do everything proper. No, I don't believe some of the stuff that's being said, and for the reasons, I don't believe a lot of that garbage, but I do believe this, well, let's put it this way. Let's say I change the oil out of my car, which nobody ever does that stuff anymore. Chris probably does. He's a country boy. You change your own oil, don't you? There you go, good guy. I used to do that. You know what? I could easily change the oil out of my car and say, bless God, I don't care. Look, I'll put oil in it where I want to put it. Well, it's just dumb to put oil on the ground. You're going to eventually step into it. It's going to rain and make a big mess. And it's really not great to put oil on grass and leave it somewhere where a dog might lick or anything. I'm just saying, this idea, it don't have to be, well, bless God, I don't believe in global warming. The world's just fine. Yeah, but we're still supposed to do things right and proper and have some sense about us. You know what? If I owned a car and that thing is smoking so bad I can't even see it when I crank it up, I ought to do something about it to make it not do that. Let me tell you a real quick story here. I've told you about this Mustang. I had a 66 Mustang. You're thinking, boy, you must have been a rich kid. Well, let me give you the rundown on this car. This car was already just a piece of junk when I got it. But bless God, on the title it said 66 Ford Mustang. And people thought, when I said that, well, you had a 66 Ford Mustang. I did. And my brother aptly named it the Rustang because it looked more rusty than it did anything. But here's what happened is I got that thing. I did everything I could to keep that thing running. And at first, man, I loved that car. And, of course, Chris and the guys know this. But I'd go down the road and I'd punch that thing, that 4-bar would kick in. And I thought I was king of the highway. I was running around here like I was somebody. But eventually that thing started really to break down. And I remember we lived up here off of Westchester Drive. And I would work at Winn-Dixie on South Main. That thing got to where it smoked so bad. I'm not kidding. You could look in the rearview mirror and you couldn't see anything. I mean, it was like just smoke. And I just knew if there was no law about smoke emissions, I certainly would not have blamed the High Point Police Stop and saying, look, there's no law, but honest to goodness, there's so much smoke, it's a safety hazard. So I driving this thing, so the point I'm making is this, to be silly. You know what? This is God's land, and we should do the best we can with it. The attitude, well, who cares? No, we should care. It's just like the Bible talks about people that abuse animals. You say, where does it talk about people abuse animals? In Proverbs it says if you take care of your beast, you're a good person. So the opposite of that is these people go around beating animals and kicking cats and doing things and hanging them and all that kind of stuff and mistreating them, put them on a chain and never feed them. Don't give me, look, if I see that makes me want to go over there and just slap the fire out of somebody and then say, let me pray for you real quick, brother. But I would. If I saw a dog like that and somebody didn't have water for it and don't care about it, man, I would. It almost make me change occupations and be a Robin Hood for animals. But my point is this. Just because we're born-again Christians, I mean, bless God, no, take care of things. I'm glad my family told me to take care of things, like the kickstand on the bicycle is there for a reason. Don't just throw it in the grass, leave it out in the yard. My granddaddy had this thing, you use my tools, put them back. And if you don't put them, if I find them in the yard and it's rained on them, or if I run over my lawnmower, oh my goodness, I would not be here. There would be a place somewhere in this area that said born in 1964 and died in 1976 or 77, the age of 12 or 13. What happened to that poor child? His granddaddy killed him. Over what? Because he didn't put any tools back. Oh. And I'm not kidding. That was the rule. Take care of it. I'm just saying, if God gave us something, yeah, we ought to take care of it. And here's a little, I know this can be kind of touchy too, but while I'm on this, this is our body. This attitude, bless God, I'm going to smoke, I'm going to drink, I'm going to eat anything I want to eat because you know what? I'm free to do anything. You know what? Yeah, you can also be free to be a doggone idiot. Seriously. I think there ought to be some general things. Just take care of yourself. If everybody says everybody's dehydrated, then drink some water. But bless God, I'm going to preach and get some revival here. Man, I'm going to get everybody drinking water. If I don't get anybody saved, I'm going to do something. Man, I'm just fired up. But I'm saying, this attitude, because you're a Christian, that somehow common sense and some of the things that people make issues of, you know what? I think God wants us to take care of things.